So thank you all so much for being here. I know it's cold and icy, so it's really great to have you all here. Thank you also to Dean Ingracia, Ashley Jones, Alexis Hench, and everyone who organized this event. And then I really also just want to thank people who funded me. The College of Humanities and Sciences, the Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation, the Department of History, and also the Humanities Research Center. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues who are here, my students who are here, and my family for their support. So, today I'm going to offer a snapshot of my new book, The Crown Silence. This is the first book to actually address the links between the British monarchy and slavery over hundreds of years. Can you pull it up a little more? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the first book to address the links between the British monarchy and slavery over hundreds of years. But I want to begin with a fairly recent past. It's not working out, was it? You tried it before. Try it one more time. While that's working, I'll go ahead and get into this. So about 3 years ago, I was part of an investigation that The Guardian launched called The Cost of the Crown. And I was invited to take part in this investigation as someone who was working on the links between the royal family, the monarchy, and slavery. And at the time, I was a little hesitant to get involved. I didn't really want to share my research while I was still working on the project, but I decided I would. And so I gave them a manuscript image that I took in the Royal Archives. It ended up being splashed across the newspapers. Yes! Okay, woohoo, this is working. And so this is it. This is the manuscript image that I shared. And essentially the reason this matters is that, people have talked about the fact that the monarchy was involved in slavery in very vague terms. But what I did by sharing this manuscript with The Guardian is give them a bit of concrete proof, the receipt, if you will, and then they went to Buckingham Palace and they said, here is a piece of evidence. Will you comment on this? And so, of course, the king was put in an awkward position. He hadn't been on the throne very long. This was actually very close to his coronation. So he released a statement. And the statement was that he supported research into the monarchy's links to slavery, first of all, and then secondly, that he was going to open the archives to historians. This was covered widely by the global media. I received phone calls from journalists and all this stuff, and they said to me, how do you feel that the king is opening the archives? And I was like, he's not opening the archives. The archives have been open. Historians have been doing this work for decades. We don't need the king's approval. And so I kind of laughed it off at the time, but I also realized this was a very clever PR move on behalf of the palace, because what the palace did was they reoriented the narrative toward the king and what the king was willing to do, and not about the findings. And so I kind of put that in my back pocket as I investigated and continued on my project, knowing that this would probably be the response when this book finally came out, which it is now. So, let's also talk a little bit about the context, still fairly recent. This announcement that the king made, where he was sort of under pressure, stemmed also from controversies over race and empire that had been swirling around in Britain, but also globally. Harry and Meghan's accusations of racism within the royal family and their exit from their royal duties, decamping, moving to America, nothing worse than Americans. Barbados, removing Elizabeth II as head of state in 2021. Will encase, disastrous royal tour. I'm sure many of you saw it covered in the media. I mean, it was so bad. The Church of England's commissioners in 2023 announcing a £100 million fund that they had established to address the church's slavery ties. So this was just an avalanche of kind of things snowballing towards the crown. Together, these events underscored unresolved imperial legacies stemming from colonialism and also slavery. Historians, as I mentioned earlier, have long had access to the Royal Archives, albeit with significant restrictions, including someone has to come with you to the bathroom. I am not joking. More importantly, royal records alone cannot reveal the monarchy's role in slavery, not even close. This history requires working across many different archives: commercial archives, colonial archives, financial archives, most of which lie well beyond the palace's gates. And this is the round tower where I started off doing my research for this book in 2017. What historians confront instead are archival gaps and silences, especially acute if you work on the history of slavery. Because this archive, the archive of slavery, is fragmentary, but more importantly, it is intentionally obscuring. That is the goal of this archive. It records violence in ledgers and balance sheets. It reduces human beings to bare commodities. That was the goal of the people who made this archive. Even sanitized images, like this pastoral scene of 18th century Jamaica here, mask brutality just outside the frame. And so this is something that you have to know going into this kind of research. You're going to be met with archival documents that are going to be difficult to look at, but you need to push beyond the surface. So I'm going to begin with the Tudor origins of England's involvement. And obviously this is going to be a whirlwind tour of this book, and we're just going to be doing a few snapshots, some from different time periods. To understand why the Tudor monarchs initially invested in the transatlantic slave trade, it's crucial to address the geopolitical, the economic, and the religious context during the Tudor era, all of which I do in the book. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal claimed global dominion through papal sanction, dividing lands on paper at least, quote, not previously possessed by any Christian owner, end quote. Indigenous sovereignty was completely ignored as well as erased. The Iberian crowns were also charged by the papacy with spreading Christianity across the globe and with extracting wealth in the form of natural, material, and human resources. Due to physical constraints and military weakness, England lacked the power to challenge this system directly. But after Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s, English merchants increasingly defied Iberian monopolies, and the government looked the other way. Under Elizabeth I, illicit voyages to West Africa accelerated, and this was also because she was Protestant, and so she was encouraging these voyages. Elizabeth promoted multiple so-called Guinea ventures, loaning naval ships to merchant syndicates in exchange for a share of the profits to benefit her cash-strapped government. She didn't have the money to fund any of these, she only had vessels, and that is what she offered. These early ventures primarily sought gold, ivory, and pepper. They were not necessarily interested in enslaved people. That changed in 1563, after the Plymouth merchant adventurer John Hawkins first made a successful transatlantic slaving voyage. Hawkins had sailed to Sierra Leone and, quote, got into his possession, partly by the sword and partly by other means, end quote, around 300 Africans. He crossed the Atlantic with his human cargo, and he sold the survivors, because of course not everyone survived. He sold these to Spanish colonists in Hispaniola in exchange for animal hides, ginger, pearls, and sugar. These were worth an enormous fortune at the time. In 1564, Elizabeth offered to sponsor Hawkins' next slaving voyage by lending him a 700-ton warship, which you see here. The tonnage of this ship was more than 2.5 times that of Hawkins' entire first fleet of ships on his first voyage. This was a massive ship. Sailing in the Jesus and flying the Royal Standard gave Hawkins prestige. He could claim, and he did, that he acted under the command of the Queen of England, that he wasn't just some kind of interloper, that he was actually a sort of a state actor. When he returned from his second venture in 1565, after transporting around 400 Africans across the Atlantic to Spanish America, Hawkins and his sponsors, including the Queen, made a total of around 66,000 pounds. This is equivalent, very roughly, to 60 million US dollars today. This is a staggering 60% return on their investment and an insane amount of money at the time. Slaving was big business. 2 years later, Hawkins commanded a third transatlantic slaving venture, promising the queen, again, immense profit in gold and jewels if she reinvested. And this is a surviving letter from Hawkins to the queen, making it explicit what he intended to do. He said, regarding the voyage, I intend to do X. There is absolutely no doubt that she knew what she was investing in. She loaned him 2 royal warships, and he set out on October 2nd, 1567, with 6 ships and 408 men. But his 3rd slaving expedition ended disastrously for him, with a loss of half of his ships, including the Queen's ships, and 3/4 of his crew due to a conflict with the Spanish fleet at Veracruz, which was the principal port of New Spain. Philip II of Spain's message was clear. England was not welcome, and the English in particular, in his American empire. This episode deepened Anglo-Spanish tensions. I don't have time to get into all of that now, but I do in my book. Spain also rejected Hawkins' demands for legal redress. He tried to sue, essentially, and claim compensation of up to nearly 28,000 pounds for the loss of his goods to the Spanish fleet. This included 57 enslaved Africans, which he called, quote, of the best stature. He also valued them at 9,000 pounds, or around $8 million today. He did not receive money from Spain, but at home, he was celebrated. He was wined and dined, and he was granted a coat of arms commemorating his slaving voyages. So the English were extremely proud of these voyages, even though the final voyage ended disastrously. So now we're going to move into the Stuart era of expansion in the 17th century. The early part of this time period, when James I replaced Elizabeth on the throne, saw the expansion of English piracy and also colonization projects in the Atlantic world, as well as accelerating trade with places like West Africa. In 1618, James I granted a monopoly over all trade with West Africa to the Guinea Company. This is a fairly small company of merchants pooling their money together to monopolize trade. In 1624, the Guinea Company had erected already an English trading port on the Gold Coast in what is now modern-day Ghana. This company trafficked primarily in redwood, which was used for making high-quality dye, as well as ivory, hides, wax, and gold. They also continued to conduct these fruitless searches for gold mines that nearly bankrupted the company. So what they were really hoping to do was just stumble across riches, but of course it was not that simple. Charles I renewed the Guinea Company's monopoly in 1631. By this point, when the monopoly was renewed under King Charles I, English colonists had already begun to expand into mainland North America and the Caribbean, and they were clamoring for agricultural laborers. Once the English discovered that enslaved people could be purchased at cheap rates, and critically, that they could be made to serve for life, and that they could be made to serve in a form of hereditary slavery, the demand for coerced labor surged. The Guinea Company tried to reorient itself towards the transatlantic slave trade, and there's evidence to suggest that they did this quite rapidly. But the company faced strong competition, particularly from Dutch and independent traders at the time. During the 1640s, so this is in the midst of the English Civil War and then after in the 1650s, slave trading began to expand throughout the English Atlantic world. And it only increased during the Commonwealth era under Oliver Cromwell. So he's not a royal, but he still plays a critical part in this story. Cromwell in Parliament reorganized and expanded England's navy, and this was a really important moment in the 17th century. They promoted overseas commerce, they passed navigation acts to add tax revenue streams, and they launched the ambitious Western design against the Spanish Indies. The goal of the Western design was to take Hispaniola, to conquer it and take it from the Spanish. This failed absolutely miserably, but they ended up with the consolation prize at the time, and that was the conquest of Jamaica. They weren't sure what to do with it at the time, but Jamaica ended up becoming the most important slave colony in Britain's Atlantic Empire in the 18th century. So this is a really critical moment in the story. After the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, so now we have the royals back in 1660, 1260, Charles II, as you see here, and his brother James, Duke of York, aggressively expanded English slave trading. The king granted a monopoly charter 6 months after he took the throne to the royal adventurers, later reorganized as the Royal African Company. Rising demand for slave labor in England's plantation colonies meant that there were significant profits to be made from capturing a share of the transatlantic slave trade, but also from enlarging England's colonial labor force. So this is a two-pronged approach. King Charles, his wife Queen Catherine, James Duke of York, their cousin Prince Rupert, the Queen Mother, the King's sister, and other royals subscribed large sums to this slave trading company. The king also lent ships, again, from the Royal Navy to get the slave trade off the ground, but also to protect convoys of slaving vessels as they were leaving West Africa or cruising along the coast. During the 1660s, the Royal Adventurers transported thousands of Africans to Barbados and Jamaica, but ultimately they fell into financial difficulties due to a lack of liquid capital. And this is because they were primarily trading on credit, and they were not getting that money back in time. So the company was about to go bust. But in 1672, King Charles granted a new charter to the reorganized Royal African Company, which from the outset benefited from the Crown's material, political, and symbolic support. This was a company that was intertwined with the Stuart dynasty and was associated directly with the monarchy. James, the Duke of York, served as the Royal African Company's governor. He was its largest shareholder. He held meetings of this company in his palace apartments. He was also Lord High Admiral, which is another important part of the story, which means that he had control over the deployment of naval vessels, and he used his authority to enforce the company's monopoly. This was extremely unpopular at the time because essentially the government and the crown were using their own resources to benefit from a monopoly that they were benefiting from, and they were preventing their subjects who were not part of this company from making money off of the transatlantic slave trade. King Charles issued proclamations limiting trade with Africa to the Royal African Company and saying that people would be punished if they didn't obey his demands. He ordered colonial governors to prosecute so-called interlopers. These are people who are not part of the monopoly. Coins that were minted from Royal African Company gold and silver were imprinted with elephants or elephant and castle provenance marks. These emphasized royal backing of this coin and of this company. And part of the significance of this is that this provenance mark was minted for decades to come. And this included gold guineas, silver crowns, half crowns, and shillings. So this is circulating as part of material culture and linking the monarchy to the expansion of wealth and to the enrichment of the nation, specifically through slave trading. So they were proud of these connections at the time. Between 1672 and the early 1720s, the Royal African Company transported around 150,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, overwhelmingly to the Caribbean, encouraging the expansion of slave trading and coerced labor in the English plantation colonies, generating substantial revenue for the Stuart monarchy. This revenue comes in the form of things like stock dividends. This is a book of dividends from the Royal African Company archival collection. Also in the form of gifts of gold. So James was given purses filled with gold, for example. His initials were also branded, and this is what you're seeing in this lower image, onto the bodies of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, and who were employed by the Royal African Company in their coastal factories. These individuals were known as, quote, castle slaves. And I'd be happy to talk more about this during the Q&A. Even more lucrative was the customs revenue on slave-produced colonial commodities, notably sugar and tobacco, which comprised a third share of the Crown's ordinary income by the late 1680s. The ordinary income in the sense of this is the income they use to just operate. It's not extraordinary income, it's just part of their regular income they rely upon. 1/3 of it is connected to plantation output, connected to slavery, already by the 1680s. So the critical point here, and what I say in my book, is that slavery underwrote the fiscal state. The royal treasury and the emergence of the fiscal state. Oops. Royal patronage of the slave trade also shaped culture and consumption practices at home. So my book includes a number of images as well. And that's because it's really impossible to talk about slavery solely in economic terms. You have to think about the impact on culture, on great ideas about race, and on gender and sexuality. Slavery became both visible in England and also fashionable. Enslaved African children appeared at court, so they were actually at court, as well as images of them in portraiture, so representations of enslaved children. Charles II's mistresses, specifically, and there's 3 of them here for you to look at, commissioned images featuring black pages as status symbols, wearing silver or pearl collars around their necks. So in these 3 images, we've got 3 different mistresses of the king. In this image, you have enslaved boys who have collars around their necks. There's an enslaved attendant in the back here with a collar, and then this child is wearing a pearl collar which gestures towards, when you first look at it, you might think, oh, it's just a necklace, but it is meant to symbolize an enslaved woman's collar. This imagery underscored these women's connections to the monarchy by the rarity of their attendance, but also to King Charles specifically because his nickname was, quote, Black Boy. This was due to his dark hair and his swarthy complexion. So there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek aspects in this art as well, what's going on at the time, and clearly at the expense of the unnamed enslaved individuals that are in these paintings. The association between the monarchy and England's early slave empire continued after the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Although the Royal African Company lost its principal royal benefactor, and James II was chased out of the country for his Catholicism and his absolutist pretensions, William III, who had replaced him, agreed to serve as the new governor of the Royal African Company. He was gifted 1,000 pounds of Royal African Company shares in exchange for his patronage, and that is the manuscript document that I showed you at the beginning, showing that transfer. At the same time, William and Mary continued to feature enslaved individuals at court. They continued this tradition of royalty and prominent persons surrounding themselves with black attendants. As recently as 2023, this bust of an enslaved man that you see here, which was commissioned by William III, was on public display in Kensington Palace in the Queen's Gallery, which is in the image. This is an image that I took. It was positioned next to a sign that essentially said, "Here are home comforts and beautiful treasures collected by Mary." And I thought, wow, I cannot believe this. And the signage said, "This is a servant." And so I actually complained to the curator, and I said, this is, not only is this incorrect, this is extremely distasteful, and then they took it down. It's somewhere else now, but this was in 2023, so this gives you an idea of how kind of behind the times the royal family is and the people who are advising them. So this is not just past, this is absolutely present. In 1698, the Royal African Company lost its monopoly by an act of Parliament, which led to an explosion of slave trading by independent merchants. And they were initially required to pay a 10% tax on outward cargoes to Africa to the company because the company had invested in the creation of all of these forts on the coast of West Africa. This opening of the slave trade leads to an explosion of growth financially, and this is evident in the customs books of the time. It shows an increasing number of slaving vessels arriving in places like Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, but also, and critically, in the Chesapeake colonies, which were underserved regions prior to the 18th century. This leads to a subsequent increase in agricultural output as well as customs revenue. Again, the fiscal state benefiting from the explosion of slave trading. So even if the company itself, the Royal African Company, is no longer as involved, the monarchy is still continuing to benefit because of the customs revenue, because of the growth of empire, because of all of these things being intertwined. In 1713, Queen Anne secured the Asiento contract, deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans annually to Spanish America for a 30-year period. Although Britain had its own plantation colonies, access to Spanish markets was viewed as a potentially lucrative prize and also an opportunity for contraband trade, which is what they were really hoping to engage in, and transferred the contract to the South Sea Company. This was a joint stock company created in 1711 to manage Britain's immense national debt. It was more than a Ponzi scheme. We can talk about this more later if you want to, but it kind of was also a Ponzi scheme. Owners of illiquid government debt could swap their holdings for liquid shares in this slave trading company, providing investors with a stake in the slave trade to Spanish America. Anne offered the South Sea Company royal warships to get this going, like her predecessors had in the past. She also invested personally in the company, but then she died. So the company scrambled for a little bit, but they were lucky because the incoming Hanoverian monarchs, George I, George II, both of whom invested in the company, also served as governors of the company. And I talk about this in my book. They were pretty buddy-buddy with the South Sea Company. Slave trading continued to be viewed as a source of both national wealth and as a business enterprise that was associated with the monarchy. And I want to go back just for a second and show you, because I realize I skipped this. This was the brand that was put on the bodies of people who were being transported to Spanish America by the South Sea Company. And so this is the logo of the company with a crown on top. And so again, you have the symbolism of the monarchy and the company. It's all very clear what is happening here. There is no confusion about these connections. I'm just reiterating this because, I've been attacked by the right-wing press who said, she just made all this up. Well, here it is. Didn't make it up. In total, during the 30-year period of the Asiento, the South Sea Company embarked with roughly 43,000 Africans from by the Benin, the Gold Coast, West Central Africa, the Windward Coast, Senegambia, and East Africa. These captives who survived the harrowing 8-week journey crossing the Atlantic disembarked in either the bases of the company, which were in Jamaica or Barbados, for so-called refreshment, which that is what it says in the South Sea Company archives, that they were going to be refreshed in these places, and imprisonment in holding pens, because that's what refreshment actually involved, before transshipment to Spanish America. Or they had to sail all the way directly to Spanish American ports, chiefly humanitarians. By the mid-18th century, Britain dominated the transatlantic slave trade. Slaving and related industries such as sugar refining, shipbuilding and repairing, marine insurance, and retailing enriched major outports and really became the making of cities like Liver and Bristol, as well as the capital. Britain's wealthiest Atlantic colonies were still the Caribbean sugar islands, where the vast majority of the population was enslaved. Planters relied on a steady arrival of Africans to make up for the absolutely brutal working conditions and shockingly high mortality rates. So this was a machine that just cranked people out in service of, making people rich, basically. George III, king in 1760, he inherited not only this Atlantic slave empire, but also its underlying racial assumptions. At the time when he was young, and before he became king, he questioned European justifications for the enslavement of Africans when he was Prince of Wales, and he wrote this down in his commonplace book, which is in the royal archives. But, as I argued in my book, this was a man who was a very prudent monarch, who wanted to create an empire, to maintain an empire, to expand his empire. He was committed to British imperial expansion. He accepted slavery as a necessary evil throughout his reign. And so while we might look at his musing as a teenager and see signs of, kind of thinking a little bit about the morality of this, the immorality of this, it didn't make any difference in terms of what he did, of his behavior. British victories in the 7 Years' War brought new possessions in North America and the Caribbean to the British Empire. You've got really a huge uptick in trade. Imperial competition and expansion increased, again, the demand for enslaved labor. It also, and critically, militarized enslaved people first ones into the breach, exploring. They were the ones who were doing the hardest work, the most likely to succumb to any kind of illness or other conditions. The reliance on enslaved laborers as well as enslaved soldiers ultimately led to the formation of the Black West India Regiment, which was led by all white officers. Between 1795 and 1808, more than 13,000 enslaved African men were purchased at a total cost of nearly £1 million in public funds in the King's name, making the Crown the largest single purchaser of enslaved people globally. And this is really on the eve of the abolition of transatlantic slave trade. However, by the late 18th century, abolitionists, and this includes white activists, but also a group that I talk about in my book, the Sons of Africa, formerly enslaved people who have become activists on behalf of the abolition movement, they're starting to challenge Britain's transatlantic slave trade. But they face royal opposition. During the abolition debates in Parliament, the Duke of Clarence, this fine-looking man you see here, he is the third son of George III, the future William IV. He allied publicly with the West Indian lobby. He defended the slave trade and he defended colonial slavery in the House of Lords, and his pro-slavery speeches were printed and widely disseminated to the public because it was a big deal that a member of the royal family in the House of Lords is rising up and defending the West India merchants, the West India planters, slavery as a system, as well as the transatlantic slave trade itself. The West India lobby was absolutely thrilled with the Duke of Clarence. They wanted to dine him, they gave him expensive gifts, including what you see here is the gold-plated Jamaica service, which was paid for by funds from the Jamaica Assembly and is still in the royal collection. Hard to see, but it's there. Liverpool merchants named slaving vessels the Duke of Clarence in his honor. And so this was something that was widely advertised at the time. And people knew about it, whether they were abolitionists or whether they were pro-slavery. They knew that the Duke of Clarence was on their side and that secretly he probably was representing the views of the king. Royal opposition to abolition, both public and behind the scenes, helped to stall the passage of parliamentary legislation to abolish this trade for 2 decades. So it really mattered that the royal family was opposed to abolition. Meanwhile, the lives of approximately 700,000 people who were still enslaved, their lives changed very little after the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807. And this is what leads enslaved people, consequently, to take matters into their own hands. They staged rebellions in Barbados in 1816, and this is a flag, this is a drawing of a flag that has not survived, but was raised by the insurgents in Barbados. In Demerara in 1823, and in Jamaica in 1831, this was known as the Christmas Rebellion, essentially making it very clear through repeated enslaved resistance that Britain could not only lose its Caribbean holdings like France had lost Saint Denis, but also that enslaved people demanded recognition of their humanity, and that they also saw themselves as loyal and equal subjects. And that is why I wanted you to see this image, because this is not an image of rebellion in the sense that they were painted by the British press, that they were just people trying to rebel and wreak havoc and violence. These are people who want to belong, who are attached to symbolism of things like the crown and what Britain meant to them and being a subject meant, and that they had not received that recognition, so they were going to take it for themselves. Britain's Emancipation Act of 1833 instituted an apprenticeship system that lasted until 1838. So this system basically meant that newly freed people, allegedly freed, above the age of 6 were required to labor for their former enslavers for a period of 4 to 6 years. So this was just slavery by another name. The British government at the same time also compensated enslavers £20 million for the loss of their human property. This was a debt the government took on, was not paid off by British taxpayers until 2015. And when that figure became known, that also increased outrage in Britain that this took that long, and people who are the descendants of enslaved people were formerly enslaved people received absolutely nothing from the British government. Victoria's reign was reframed, Victoria's reign reframed the monarchy as a humanitarian institution, as an institution that believed in anti-slavery. And this is a really critical moment in British history because it is so effective, and it has really created the era of silences that we are still in now. In the words of one contemporary, under Victoria, Britain was ruled, quote, by the most humane sovereign the world has ever witnessed on an earthly throne. And there's a lot of art and print media of the time praising Victoria for being this champion of liberty and freeing enslaved people who should be deeply grateful for her sacrifice and for what the British people were willing to do for the enslaved. On June 1st, 1840, Prince Albert captured this sentiment when he delivered the opening speech at the first meeting of the Society for the Extinction of the Slave Trade. In front of thousands of spectators, Albert made what I call the first royal statement of regret for slavery. This was a statement of regret crafted to accentuate Britain's heroic role in the fight to end the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm going to read you a little clip from this statement. Quote, I deeply regret that the benevolent and the persevering exertions of England to abolish that atrocious traffic in human beings, at once the desolation of Africa and the blackest stain upon civilized Europe, have not as yet led to any satisfactory conclusion. Prince Albert did not apologize. Silence became policy, but his speech was met with roaring applause because people thought at the time, finally, the monarchy has embraced anti-slavery. That's all that matters. All they have to do is be on our side. That is enough. And so that has really set the tone for the current order that we've inherited now. This strategy of silence persists to this day. British monarchs, members of the royal family, members of the government, whether they are Tory or Labour, they have followed Prince Albert's lead, framing the past as something regrettable, something to move beyond, but definitely not something to talk about. Historians who challenge this narrative are dismissed as shameful, utterly shameful. But my response is that the past is shameful. And so confronting it is our job. It's necessary. The recent release of my book, as you see here from this Guardian piece, has renewed calls for the king to issue a formal apology for slavery. His response to my book was, the king does not comment on books. So in 2023, he said, well, I'm going to open up the archives, but now that the book is out, well, I'm not going to comment. I don't know how long that's going to last. I don't know how long he's going to be able to get away with not saying anything. And I think the work of historians is vital. I think that we provide the receipts, and I think that that's what we should be doing, and that's what I tell my students. Like, get in the archives. This is your job, and it's very important. So, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
That was definitely a whirlwind
history lesson. Congratulations, I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm Pat Cummins, and I actually work on Haiti, and have looked at some of the similar things where people were told in 1825 they were free, but they had to have reparations until 1946. And there should have been earlier things even before 25. But I was wondering, in terms of the West African peoples who were seized during the slave trade, were they from all of the old Mali Empire? Was it pretty much every country? Were there specific ethnic groups that were affected?
There are so many different ethnic groups that were affected. I honestly can't go into all the different ethnic groups that were affected because there's so many different regions. We're talking about West Africa, West Central Africa, East Africa. I mean, I'm just not an expert in Africa enough to tell you all of the ethnicities involved here. But the important point is that for the to create fictitious identities for people. They would just say, well, all the people in this region, and they would just kind of make up a region, are Coromantese, or they are this, or they are that. And then they would start to identify certain characteristics with these people. And they would say, these are the people who are the hardiest, or these are the people who are the most likely to rebel. And that is in the English archives. And so if you actually just use the archival evidence, you can actually get a very skewed understanding of what it was actually like on the ground all along the coast of West Africa, because these are just racial constructs. And so I think that if you want to know all that sort of stuff, you need to read the African historian's work, which is extremely rich and detailed on this issue. And also the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It actually, the slave voyages, if anyone has seen that, it is online, it's freely accessible. I tell my students to look at it. It tracks the movement of people, where they're embarking, where they're disembarking, and the regions that they're from. But still, I don't think it gets into as much detail as what you're looking at, because it's really more regional, because people are marched to these locations. They're marched to places like Cape Coast Castle. They are stripped of their identities and their kinship networks, and then they're renamed something like Caesar and sent off somewhere they've never been, and then they are lost in the archives. And so it's so difficult to trace some of these connections. They're obviously very important work to do.
I got a question that's kind of twofold. First of all, great research. I'm looking forward to reading the book. So, in your research, did you find any justification by the monarchy to participate in the slave trade? Have they ever provided that, whether it be religious or whatnot? Because it seems like, history shows it was only to enrich the wealth of the country. And then why was it allowed to go unchecked or not even talked about or discussed before you brought it to the light again?
Excellent questions. Thank you for those questions. So in the book, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the involvement of the monarchy changes over time depending on the constitutional position of the monarchy. So what kind of power do they have? How much wealth do they have? So during the Tudor-Stuart era, the monarchy is hamstrung by financial limitations, but they don't have the same restrictions on them that subsequent monarchs have. And so they're able to do things like give out a million monopolies to companies in order to profit from those companies, but also because companies had to pay in order to get monopoly charters. So Charles I, for example, he was just making a ton of money off of just giving out monopolies to whoever. And so they're thinking about, how can I make money? And they're not just investing in things like the transatlantic slave trade. They're investing in colonization. They're investing in commerce. They're investing in empire. They're doing all sorts of things. This is just part of their portfolio, basically. They're not thinking about it from the kind of perspective that we would now. However, that said, someone like Charles II, he still, if you asked him, would talk about religious justifications, that the English were spreading Christianity in the Americas, and that they were spreading the right kind of Christianity, Protestantism, and not Catholicism. And so there is a lot in the book actually about, gets more into the weeds about the fact that they're not actually Christianizing people on the ground. They're claiming this is all about religion, but really it's very clear it's about money. And so that is a conversation that is had because the king wants people to Christianize their enslaved laborers, because then at least he can say, well, look, we're actually doing this. But they weren't doing it. That's not what they were interested in at all. And then in response to your second question, which I think is the question, right? Why? Why is this? I think it honestly partly took an outsider. It took an American to question this institution, because this is a revered institution. This institution is wrapped up in national identity in England, to the point where if you even talk about this, you're making people very angry. Some people don't want to think about this issue. The other answer to the question, and this is just, I was just there and I walked in a bookstore and I saw Piers Morgan has a book called Woke is Dead. and it's prominently displayed. And he would see me as woke, absolutely. Do I think of myself as woke? No, it's a ridiculous construct. It means nothing. But the point is, he thinks he's already won. They've already won. They've already silenced this conversation. We don't need to be having this conversation. And so when you see these kinds of trends happening, not just in the UK, the idea that we can't talk about the past, I think people start to see it as very threatening. This affects their identity, but it also, more importantly, affects what we are owed now. What should people be willing to demand now from their institutions? And I think the book like this topic, it makes people think, wow, maybe you do owe me something. And I say, yes, they do. They absolutely do. And that was kind of what I discovered while writing this book. And I do think there's a lot more out there to be found. And I think that hopefully there'll be a whole new historiography, basically, about this topic, because I know there's more in the archives, and a bunch of students, the next generation, they're going to find it.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the Spanish or the Portuguese or the French have acknowledged their parts in any of this.
So the Dutch have. The Dutch have acknowledged, the Dutch king has actually created a commission to investigate these links. He's put some money into it. Most of the other European monarchies, especially if they're not around anymore, they have essentially not said much about this, but there is more and more research being done on this topic. And I was at a conference last summer of scholars who work on the French Empire, Portuguese, Dutch, German, Belgian, and then I was there for the English, and we are all working on this topic and digging into the archives and kind of seeing what these links are, not just to slavery, but also to things like colonization, the genocide of indigenous peoples. I mean, there's just a whole can of worms, essentially, and I think there is going to be a reckoning. And actually, the African Union has announced that 2026 to 2036 is the decade of reparations. I think it's because of the work of scholars, people coming forward, finding this material, and bringing it to public. Because if you find this stuff and you don't share it with the public, nobody knows. And that's the kind of wall I kept hitting with my first project, which is published by an academic press. We've got to write with academic presses. They do the work of publishing most of our scholarship. But if we don't reach out to the public, nobody understands this is a real story. This history is out there. And I think that is going to be happening across Europe as well because of the different scholars working on this stuff. And then also the creation of online digitized materials, which universities often will fund, and I think that is critical because it doesn't matter necessarily if you've read a book. If you find out there's a database where you can go and see what percentage of the Spanish population had a connection to slavery, or in the UK, UCL, University College London, they have a database called Legacies of British Slavery, where you can look to the individual person and see who was compensated in the 1830s, and then you can trace their genealogy and see that somebody like David Cameron, former PM, his ancestors were compensated. And so, there's this web of complicity that the archives enables us to build. And this is why I love being a historian.
Do you anticipate art history books, K-12, to incorporate these types of lessons?
Not anytime soon, no.
My daughter taught me this. I mean, she was in humanities in high school.
Wow.
And
I mean,
shared that with me.
My kids have told me some of the stuff they learned about Pocahontas and George Washington, and I'm like, what? This is 2026. So I think this stuff is slow to change minds, but to change school boards and the people who create textbooks, that is a whole controversial thing, and that is all about power. It's not necessarily about the historical record. And so I don't know about that. But I do think that at least incrementally, we're going to see more awareness of this. And I think that you can take signs down, like what happened at the president's house in Philadelphia very recently, after historians like Erica Dunbar worked really hard to show the connections between George Washington and the fact that he and his wife owned people and moved them between Philadelphia and Virginia and rotated them every 6 months because they had a local law that if you were there for more than 6 months, you had to be automatically freed. He rotated them. She wrote a whole book about this, won a bunch of awards, changed the way the public understood the president's role and connection to slavery. Like, really amazingly did this amazing work. Finally, this got out into museums and into the president's house and on display to the public, and now it is being taken down. And so what that suggests to me is that it's dangerous, potentially, for people to know this history. Why is it dangerous? I think to some extent it's because we are too worried about, like, what can the younger generations handle? They can handle a lot, you know? I think they can. Like, I've seen my students, they can handle it. But I think there's this idea that if people are confronted with the past, with things that our ancestors did that we're ashamed of, then we're gonna question ourselves. We're gonna question ourselves as a nation, as a people, who we are, and then everything's gonna unravel. And I just don't think we're that weak. You know, I think we can actually talk about these things.
So I read somewhere, probably on social media, but that I believe it was the figuring out how to have vanilla, you know, the actual like growing vanilla was based from a plantation in the Caribbean, and it was actually figured out by a 12-year-old enslaved boy, and so I'm sure that his owners profited from that. And I was wondering if in your research, you know, there's different parts of Africa, like people had figured out how to grow rice very well. So those Africans were the ones that were prized to send to, say, South Carolina because they knew how to grow rice. Did anything in your research like come up like families that had really benefited from certain things being figured out by their enslaved people, or that the knowledge that they had like benefited it, and then it's like went around the world, you know, like.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Not in this particular book, because it's about an institution that is more connected to the state. And so my research actually is more focused on, especially in the 18th century, on how people were used in military capacities, and how the crown essentially started to pivot from investing in the transatlantic slave trade, expanding slavery to benefit from the customs revenue, to then also using people on an individual level to support them in places like the docklands, where you bring a ship to be careened, and that's where they would actually train enslaved laborers to do this skilled work, and they called them the king's slaves. So in those cases, you can see that there are actually individual families who are doing this skilled labor, and they're doing it in the name of the king and to the financial benefits of the king. And I wrote, it's in the book, but I also wrote a Smithsonian magazine piece specifically about some of those people, but also a number of people who were auctioned off in Barbados, and the families were separated, and the king received the payment afterwards. And this is in the 1820s. And so it's not always, I mean, I know there's the stories about, you know, people inventing things, in which there's so many of those, but there's also people who just lived and worked, and their lives benefited the monarchy, you know, and they didn't have to do anything special other than just be, and they were still being exploited.
Let's give another round of applause. I want to thank Brooke for a fantastic presentation. I also want to thank the staff in the Dean's Office, Alexis Fins, Ashley Jones, and Orna Weinstein, who made this event possible. There is a reception. Brooke's book will be for sale outside. She will be signing copies. You can also ask her other questions, but again, it is so heartening to see a room full of engaged people for such important work, and we thank you all for being here.